Most founders I know own at least 50 books. They have shelves full of them, Kindle libraries they will never finish, and a highlights folder in Redwise that has not been opened in 6 months. And yet they are still running their business like they have read none of them, reactive, stretched thin, making decisions all day and wondering why nothing meaningful actually moves. The problem is not information. You do not have an information problem. What you have is an execution problem, and the reason most books do not fix it is because they get read once, shelved, and quietly forgotten. This one is different. The founders who have actually crossed 7 figures do not treat The One Thing by Gary Keller like a book they read. They treat it like a system they run. Here is the contrast that should bother you. The busy founder wakes up, opens their inbox, answers 40 messages before 9 a.m., attends 3 back-to-back calls, and ends the day exhausted, but no closer to the thing that actually builds the business. The scaled founder does one thing before any of that happens. One thing, protected, non-negotiable, and somehow they move faster. That is not a hustle difference. That is a resource allocation difference. By the end of this, you will have a specific system to audit your next 24 hours and figure out exactly where your highest leverage move is hiding. Here is the trap most founders fall into, and almost none of them see it clearly. They wake up and immediately become the chief everything officer. Every task gets treated as equally urgent. Every notification gets a response. Every problem gets their attention right now because they have built a business that runs on their personal bandwidth. And somewhere along the way, they confused being busy with making progress. Keller is direct about this in The One Thing. He says that going small, deliberately narrowing your focus to the one most important thing, is not a limitation on what you can accomplish. It is actually how leverage works. Most founders read that and nod, then go back to their 47-item to-do list, because the idea sounds right, but the instinct to do more feels urgent. What's actually happening in that moment is a cognitive error, not a time management error. Every decision you make pulls from the same finite pool of mental energy. Low stakes decisions, high stakes decisions, they all cost something. So when you spend the first 90 minutes of your day triaging emails, approving minor expenses, and responding to Slack messages, you're not just filling time, you're spending from an account that does not refill midday. Cal Newport makes the same point in Deep Work. Your capacity for focused, high-quality thinking is not stable across the day. It degrades in real time, and the rate of degradation is tied directly to how many decisions and context switches you have already burned through. The math on context switching alone should change how you structure your mornings. Research puts the productivity cost of switching between tasks at roughly 40% of your total output. Not 40% of one task, 40% of your entire productive capacity, gone, because your brain has to reload the mental context every single time you shift focus. That means most founders are operating at around 60% of their actual capability before they have even started on anything that matters. Think about what that means across a week. A founder working 50 hours is effectively getting about 30 hours of real cognitive output. And if those 30 hours are fragmented across email, meetings, and reactive problem solving, the number of hours spent on genuinely high leverage work might be closer to 5. The real hours are the ones that actually move the business forward. Keller's entire framework in The One Thing is built on the recognition that this is a structural problem, not a discipline problem. You do not fix it by trying harder or waking up earlier. You fix it by changing the architecture of how your day is built, specifically by deciding in advance what the one thing is and making sure it gets your best hours before anything else gets a chance to drain them. The solution is not more willpower. It is a different design entirely. If you want to read The One Thing for yourself, the Amazon link is at the top of the description. As an Amazon associate, I earn from qualifying purchases. Before we get to the architecture, we need to talk about the question that makes the whole system work. Without that question, time blocking is just rearranging your calendar, and habit design becomes wishful thinking dressed up as a routine. Keller builds the entire second half of The One Thing around what he calls the focusing question. What is the one thing I can do such that, by doing it, everything else becomes easier or unnecessary? That is the sentence. Read it again. It is doing more work than it looks like. Most founders, when they first encounter it, treat it like a motivational prompt, something you write in a journal on a Sunday night and then forget by Monday at 8 a.m. But that's not what it is. It's a first principles diagnostic tool. It's asking you to find the bottleneck, the single constraint in your business that, if removed, unlocks downstream progress on everything else. That's not soft thinking. That's how engineers debug systems and how the best operators I've come across actually run their weeks. The reason most founders don't naturally think this way is because they treat their to-do list as a flat sequence. Task 1, Task 2, Task 3, all roughly equal, all needing to get done. What the focusing question does is expose the leveraged dependencies hiding underneath that list. It forces you to ask which one of these tasks, if done well, makes 3 other tasks either simpler or completely pointless. Keller calls this the lead domino. The idea is simple. Line up a row of dominoes, and the first one, when it falls, sets off a chain that moves everything behind it. One action, done at the right moment, collapses a stack of other problems on its own. The mistake founders make is spending their best hours on the middle dominoes, the ones that feel productive, that generate visible output, that fill the day with motion, while the lead domino sits untouched because it requires more thought, more courage, or more sustained focus than a fragmented morning allows. Greg McKeown makes a similar argument in Essentialism. His framing is that most of us are spreading our effort across a dozen directions and getting weak results across all of them, when the same effort concentrated on one direction would produce results that actually compound. He calls it the disciplined pursuit of less. Not laziness, but discipline. There is a real difference between those two things, and most people conflate them because doing less feels uncomfortable when you have built an identity around being busy. Here's a concrete version of how this breaks down in practice. A founder spends 3 hours a week producing social media content. It feels necessary, it generates some engagement, it checks a box. But if one direct sales conversation, just one, would land a contract that makes the next quarter's revenue target irrelevant, then the content wasn't the lead domino. It was busy work with better aesthetics. The focusing question cuts through that. It forces a real answer to a real question. Which single action right now makes the most other things unnecessary? And the honest answer is almost never the thing you have been spending your mornings on. Knowing the right question, though, is only half the system, because you can ask it perfectly and still get nothing done if you haven't protected the time to actually answer it. Protection is the right word for it. Not scheduling, not planning, protection. Keller dedicates a full section of the one thing to time blocking, and the way he frames it matters. He's not talking about color coding your Google Calendar or batching your emails into 2 windows. He's talking about treating your most important work like a non-negotiable commitment, the kind you don't reschedule because something more convenient came up. His argument is that until your one thing has a defended block of time in your day, it isn't actually a priority, it's just an intention. And intentions, without structure, evaporate by Tuesday. Here's the reframe that tends to land with founders. That block isn't a task on your to-do list. It's a meeting with your future self, and it's worth more than almost any other meeting on your calendar. You wouldn't cancel a call with your most important investor because a team member had a minor question. But most founders do the equivalent of that every single morning. They let low priority requests chip away at the one block of time that's actually building the business. Newport makes a similar case in deep work, though he comes at it from a slightly different angle. His argument is that scheduling your time in advance functions as a pre-commitment device. When you decide the night before exactly what you're doing at 8 a.m., you remove the in-the-moment decision entirely. There's no negotiation, no weighing of options, no maybe I'll just check a few things first. The decision is already made. That matters because the moment you allow yourself to negotiate with the block, you've already lost, because your brain will always find a reason to do the easier thing. What Keller adds that Newport doesn't fully address is the architecture around the block itself. In The One Thing, Keller recommends 3 distinct types of time blocks, not one. First, the block for your one thing, your deep work, your lead domino, your highest leverage output. Second, a planning block, time set aside to actually think about your business at a strategic level rather than just reacting to it. Third, a rest block, protected recovery time that most founders treat as optional and then wonder why their output degrades across the week. Most founders, if they're being honest, only protect the first one. They'll guard the deep work block reasonably well, at least for the first few days after watching a video like this. But the planning time gets swallowed by operational fires, and the rest gets sacrificed on the altar of productivity, right up until they burn out and lose 2 weeks to exhaustion and decision fatigue. Keller is explicit on this point in the book. Protecting only the work block without protecting the recovery block is how the system collapses. You can't run a high output schedule on depleted resources indefinitely. The math doesn't work, regardless of motivation level. The other common failure mode is treating the block as flexible. I'll catch up tomorrow, just this once. Keller calls this out directly. Every time you negotiate with the block, you're not just losing that session, you're training yourself that the block is optional, and optional things don't survive contact with a busy week. So the block is set. But even founders who get this far, who protect their time and show up consistently, tend to hit a wall at around the 3-week mark. And the reason has nothing to do with motivation. 3 weeks is almost exactly where the research says the white-knuckling phase ends and the real test begins. Keller addresses this directly in The One Thing, and he is one of the few productivity writers willing to call out the myth by name. The idea that a habit forms in 21 days isn't just oversimplified. It's wrong, and believing it is one of the main reasons founders abandon systems that would have worked if they had stayed in them slightly longer. The actual number, based on research out of University College London, is closer to 66 days, not 21. And that is an average. Depending on the complexity of the behavior, it can run longer. What that means practically is that most founders quit right in the middle of the hardest part, convinced the system isn't working, when what is actually happening is that the neural pathway has not been laid down yet. They are in the construction phase and they have stopped building. Keller's framing in The One Thing is that willpower is a depletable resource, and any system that depends on willpower as its primary fuel is going to fail eventually. That is not a character flaw, it is just how the brain works. The goal of habit architecture is not to become someone who is better at forcing themselves to do hard things. It is to build an environment where the hard thing gradually becomes the default and the willpower requirement drops close to zero. That is the real distinction between white-knuckling and rewiring. White-knuckling is showing up every morning and grinding through resistance. Rewiring is reaching the point where skipping the block feels more uncomfortable than doing it. Keller argues that most founders never get there because they treat the first 3 weeks of discomfort as evidence that something is wrong rather than evidence that something is working. This connects directly back to the cognitive debt we covered earlier, but from the opposite direction. We talked about how a poorly designed morning drains your capacity before your most important work starts. The flip side is that a well-designed environment actively lowers the cost of doing your one thing. Your physical setup, your phone, your first decision of the day, the cues that exist in your workspace, all of it is either pulling you toward the block or away from it, and most founders have never audited any of it. McKeown puts it plainly in Essentialism. Protecting the asset is non-negotiable. He is talking about your physical and mental energy as the single most important input in the whole system. You can have the right question, the right block, the right calendar, and still produce nothing, because the environment you have built is quietly draining the fuel before you ever sit down to work. So the audit is not abstract. Walk through your actual morning. What is the first thing you touch? Where is your phone? What does your workspace look like when you arrive? Every one of those details is either reinforcing the habit or eroding it. Get that architecture right, and the 66 days become survivable. But once it is in place, there is one final layer most founders miss entirely. And it is the reason two people can run the identical system and get completely different results. Keller calls them the four thieves, and they show up in the one thing as the final piece of the diagnostic, the reason identical systems produce wildly different outcomes depending on who's running them. These aren't personality flaws, they're structural vulnerabilities, and every one of them can be identified and closed. The first thief is the inability to say no. Keller is blunt about this in the book. Every yes you give to a low leverage request is a direct no to your one thing. Not a metaphorical no, a literal one, because your time and energy are finite and you've just allocated them somewhere else. Most founders struggle here because they've built relationships and team cultures where being available feels like leadership. Keller's position is that real leadership at the highest levels looks like protecting your output so aggressively that the people around you have to rise to fill the gaps. Saying yes to everything isn't generosity, it's a slow leak in your most important resource. The second thief is fear of chaos. This one is subtle because it masquerades as responsibility. A founder commits to their one thing block, and within 48 hours something slips. A deadline gets missed, a client follows up twice, an internal process wobbles. The instinct is to abandon the block and go fix it, because the chaos feels urgent and the one thing feels abstract by comparison. Keller's argument in The One Thing is that this trade-off is real, but it is temporary. The chaos at week one of a new system is not the same as the chaos 6 months in, after the system has had time to compound. The founders who bail at the first sign of friction never find out what the other side looks like. The third thief is poor health habits, and the one thing is direct, in a way most business books are not. Physical energy is a cognitive input. Sleep, movement, and nutrition are not lifestyle choices that exist outside your business. They are inputs that determine the ceiling on your output. Newport touches on this in deep work as well, noting that sustained deep work requires a physical substrate that can actually support it. Running your most important cognitive work on 4 hours of sleep and 2 coffees is not discipline. It is running a high-performance engine on the wrong fuel and expecting it to hold up. The fourth thief is environment, and we have already seen how this works at the micro level of your workspace. But Keller means it more broadly. Who you spend time with, what conversations you are in, which commitments are quietly draining your calendar every week, all of it either supports the one thing or competes with it. Newport's concept of depth rituals from deep work applies here. Consistent environmental cues that signal to your brain it is time for focused work are one of the fastest ways to reduce the friction of actually starting. Now put all four together into what I call the zero-based energy audit. The process is simple. List every recurring commitment in your week, every meeting, every standing call, every obligation you said yes to that now shows up automatically. Then run the focusing question on each one. Ask yourself, does this make my one thing easier or does it make it harder? You are not looking for tasks to feel good about cutting. You are looking for the ones that are quietly making the whole system leak. This is where the one thing, deep work, and essentialism stop being 3 separate books and start functioning as a single operating system. Keller gives you the question and the structure. Newport gives you the mechanics of protecting focus. McCune gives you the discipline to cut what does not belong. Run them together, and you have something most productivity advice never produces, a framework that actually changes what you do on Monday morning. Run the zero-based energy audit before you open your inbox tomorrow. 1 pass, 15 minutes, and you will know exactly where your lead domino is hiding. Now, there is one problem most founders hit at this exact point, and it is the reason 2 people can run the identical system and get completely different results. You have the focusing question. You have protected the block. You have closed the 4 thieves, and you still cannot produce at the level you know you are capable of. Not because the system is wrong, but because of something happening at the cognitive level that Keller does not fully get into. Cal Newport spent years studying the people who actually do produce at that level, and what he found was not a better calendar. It was a specific type of mental work that most people have quietly trained themselves out of. We have gone deep on that book, and we have a take on it that is probably different from anything you have seen. If the system from today is the what and the why, that video is the how, the mechanics of actually thinking at the level the one thing requires. Click the video on screen now.